Okay, so we are now live stream. So hello everyone, welcome to our weekly live stream. Today with me is our vice permit CEO
and co-founder.
and co-founder. Sorry, I want to say founder, but he put the co in it.
Actually, it's my co-founder that put the co in it.
Yeah. And today we are going to talk about authentication and authorization in healthcare. And with me, Paul and Jason, both are well-known personas in the landscape or the space of authentication, particularly and security in healthcare. And let's start with let them introduce themselves. So, Paul, do you want to start?
Sure, yeah. I'm Paul Pettite. I've been working in identity for about the last 15 years, maybe unknowingly. I think a lot of folks that are in identity maybe kind of just happened into it as a function of, working with other IT. And that was definitely the case for me. I started out my career working in small community hospitals and seeing a lot of the workflow changes that were happening during electronic medical records transitions and needed identity solutions to help with that. Because the biggest ask for them was, hey, I don't want to walk into this room and have to sit there and put in a password in front of the patient. So they'd find workarounds and other ways to do it. And so I actually ended up working with tools that Jason was creating at the time from Imprivata to be able to enable badge tap, using two-factor authentication really early on in a way that, really was, I think, a workflow thing at the time, but also, bridging some of the identity gaps in healthcare. Since then, I've kind of worked in that space around that, helping to enable that for virtual desktop technology, but then also just kind of progressing the technology along over the years. Recently, worked a lot with Okta and kind of enabling healthcare customers with more modern technologies there. And then also was advising Auth, another badge tap organization that was able to integrate with tools, like Okta and Ping and things like that. So great to be here today. Thanks, guys.
Very cool. Thanks for coming on.
Sure. And Jason, do you want to give
Sure. So thank you. So Jason Mafera. I'm currently the healthcare CTO for CTO Technology. But prior to that, similar to Paul, been in the identity and access management space for, probably about 22 years now. Early in my career, started at RSA security prior to the EMC acquisition. I was the guy doing a lot of the single sign-on work that happened there, and then ultimately took over the hardware token portfolio. So started there around authentication, transitioned from RSA to Imprivata when they were still a startup. So early days of Imprivata. Essentially, I stayed there for about 12 years. First half of my tenure was in product management. So the stuff that Paul mentioned. So if you're familiar with Imprivata and healthcare, the OneSign identity and access management stack. So that was my product stack outside of the SSO component that was in there. And then the second half of my tenure at Imprivata, I transitioned to build and lead the office of the CTO with the founder and CTO of the organization. When I left Imprivata, interestingly enough, I transitioned from there to start another company with the former founder and CTO of Imprivata. A company called Tausight. Did that for a little over 3 years and then transitioned to where I am now with iGel. So have been in the identity and access management space for quite a while and have kind of transitioned as I've gone from, the product side to then some of the other technologies that have been ancillary related to it. So, yeah, really happy to be here. Thanks for having me. Looking forward to the conversation.
Thanks for joining. I think that when Paul described the way that you actually met, he exposed a unique challenge in the authentication of healthcare. In one hand, you are working in the field. Behind your back, there is a patient that can look. On the other end, there is very sensitive data that you need to access for. You don't want them to see your password or something like that. What are kind of the unique challenges that start with authentication in healthcare? Let's start with
Paul. Or you
Yeah,
want me
sure.
to
No, I mean, from my perspective, being on the actual healthcare side, I was brought in originally to kind of help with spyware and malware, getting rid of that. If you remember in the early 2000s, everyone's grandma's computer was infected with that. And so were a lot of rural hospitals. And so that's how I first got introduced. And they said, help us clean that up. So I worked through that. And then like, we have this thing called electronic medical record we need to start working on. So I thought, let's break down what we're doing today with paper. And so we did that. We had the room with all of the different pieces of paper, the notes with all the lines connecting them. And I learned a lot about all the information. I thought, okay, we got this handled. This is a lot better. We're not going to digitize all of this. But what I wasn't focusing enough on was the actual workflow of physicians. And I think that's kind of the key is they have very specific workflows. The way they interact with patients is kind of shifting from, a technical mindset into a clinical mindset, or, vice versa when you introduce technology. And so that was kind of the biggest thing I saw is after I implemented what I thought was kind of solving all of our information problems, there were a lot of workflow and productivity problems there. Physicians historically have just picked up a dictaphone, sat there, done a SOAP note in a room. They're maybe flipping through the chart. They've got a really quick process for that. When you first introduced electronic medical records 10, 15 years ago, that was different. Lots of clicking, little buttons, things maybe wouldn't work. But the biggest complaint, and the reason they were bringing their laptop to my office and saying, I don't want this anymore, was having to put passwords in front of patients, whether it was to get in the front door or into each application. But it seemed like there was so much of it and it happened so often. And that was really the biggest problem at first. The other side of that, obviously, is HIPAA. So to get around a lot of those things, there might be sharing of credentials or maybe leaving a session open. And we saw a ton of that. I mean, I'd lift up almost every mouse pad and there's 5 people's passwords under there. And Imprivata did a good job of marketing alongside that kind of stuff early on. And that's what got my attention. And so for me, I think it's really, the workflow and also the types of users you have. It's pretty unique that you have, an employee that's making a lot more than what your executive team may be making in some cases, that has a lot of influence on how they want their workflow and how, kind of their day works.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah, and I think I would reiterate what Paul said, right? I think a lot of the challenges with identity and authentication in healthcare grew directly out of that transition from paper to electronic workflows. And it was very disruptive because you had clinicians who were very used to doing things one way, doing it very manual, paper-based process, right? And they all of a sudden one day woke up and had to now transition into the more modern end of the world that other folks were doing. And, that transition had some challenges that went along with it. Primarily because, if we remember what clinicians are there for, and it's really to provide patient care. So getting, interfering with that process, right, was always a challenge. And so solutions were necessary to help to streamline some of that. And I think Imprivata, I'd like to say that it was all maybe prescriptive and purposeful. But I think in the early days, it was just another driver because Imprivata originally started out and wasn't exclusively focused on healthcare. And so that transition came along. There was that big opportunity with that, change that healthcare was going through. And the challenge they really had was first, as Paul mentioned, the number and, complexity of the passwords that were being used. So now you've got all these electronic systems you need to access. A lot of the heavy lift was put on the clinicians themselves to need to remember usernames and passwords for a whole set of disparate systems. And I'd like to say that it was, very straightforward, but it wasn't because, everyone talked for a long time about, there's no need for any sort of enterprise single sign-on because 2 years from now, everything will be fully integrated into LDAP, right? And it'll be Active Directory and you'll have one username and one password. It'll be very simple. Well, if I look at my watch, it's probably 20 years since then, and still everything is not all natively integrated. You've got different authentication backends, right? Different credentials necessary. So the complexity of the problem initially caused a lot of help desk overhead, right? So password resets, because you couldn't, as a person, without writing them down, remember all of those usernames and passwords across all of the systems you needed to access. So what did it do? It essentially interfered with delivering patient care, right? You were focused now on the technology and not so much the patient. So when we showed up on the scene, working with folks like Paul, we learned that, hey, it needs to be streamlined. It needs to be easier for the clinicians. And so originally it was really just about managing all those usernames and passwords, kind of reducing it to a single set of credentials that a user could enter and, reduce some of that overhead. But as we moved forward in time, what we found was even that was not necessarily the best workflow that could be delivered. And so, you see today, especially with what Improvat has done over time, that tap and go is somewhat ubiquitous. Definitely in North America, in a lot of other areas as well, NHS in the UK and various areas within Europe, that sort of thing. And what we found was that, that tap and go really originally was more of a convenience rather than a security feature. But it helped to streamline and hide all those usernames and passwords and reduce the complexity so that essentially the clinician could operate more effectively, more quickly, right? And focus on delivering patient care. And so I think, that those days of writing down passwords underneath the keyboard and putting them on the sticky notes, those needed to go without a doubt.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I liked what you said actually about the LDAP piece. I mean, I heard that so often, and as I've kind of moved along and helped companies now, with HR sourcing or lifecycle management, it's the same idea. Everyone's saying, "Oh, it should be, everything should be based on an IDP, and we should have this single source of truth." But I think in healthcare, that's still not the case because of a lot of the legacy applications and just the lack of support. And those are such important applications for organizations. And so that's something I saw a lot was bridging from that legacy to the modern world. All healthcare organizations right now are somewhere kind of in between where they have these legacy tools like old character-based applications that are still very crucial to some portion of their operations that can't kind of move into this modern sphere. And I think you guys probably see a lot of that, even from the, the provisioning and the rights management, space.
Yeah. I think authentication and authorization in healthcare are really in a situation of a perfect storm. The only space that's kind of similar is fintech, but I think with healthcare, it's even worse. You have the widest variety of devices, both new and legacy at the same time. You have new technologies emerging and new IoT devices and medical devices being implemented, but you're still using medical devices from the bygone days. You still need to support those. And you have a really wide area of different people with different levels of tech savviness, especially if you take into account the patients themselves, but also the practitioners. Not all of your doctors have the same level of savviness with technology as the rest. And when you combine that matrix, there's just so much area where things can go wrong and where people can get lost. And I think in the end of the day, it's not just about the technology, it's about the experiences we provide to these people around these devices, around this infrastructure. And I think you already kind of pointed out about how you streamline this. How do you go about taking these point of friction, for example, with password management, but maybe also other areas in general is streamlining the experience for all these various people around these various platforms. Is that the key? Is there somewhere else that we need to be looking at when we're thinking identity access management for healthcare?
Well, I think it goes even beyond that. So what we learned early on, and Paul, definitely throw in your comments on this, I think it really comes down to, let's say, asserting identity, delivering some form of, let's say, authenticated, capabilities around authentication that prove the identity of the user. But then that goes directly into workflow. And it's really all about the workflow. Paul mentioned it before that, it was about that transition caused a lot of clicks, right? Lots of things you needed to do beyond just typing in that username and password. Now you've got to navigate into your applications. You've got to go into different workflows depending on what you're doing, ordering medications, dispensing medications, those sorts of things. And so it was really critical to take that authentication authorization and then combine it with workflow automation. And I think that's really the secret sauce because, removing, originally I didn't think it was that big a deal. I'm like, well, you log in and you've got a few clicks and you do this thing. And then you look at how healthcare really operates. And if you had to do that once a day, like maybe, traditional business back office or business user might do, right? Open their email and then they're kind of in that application for the day. Healthcare does not operate that way, right? Clinicians are very mobile and they go through these processes 40, 50, 70 times a day. And so any place you can streamline that experience just essentially allows them to provide more focus on the patient and delivering patient care, which is really what they're there for.
Yeah. Yeah, and just as kind of an example of that, early on, it's ended up being some technology that Jason was actually working on as well. But doctors would tell me, is there a way I could maybe get the X-rays ready in the room and then go interface with the patient? Because there's this kind of concept, and it was something that I became more acutely aware of, as time went on. But that transition from thinking about how you're treating a patient clinically to having to interface with a computer just isn't natural. It's not something, as particularly, physicians who went to school 10, 12 years ago before kind of the tech transition in healthcare, they're not used to that sort of transition and having to switch mindsets and flow where you're in clinical flow and then you switch to tech flow. So removing as much of that as possible is key too. And, things like virtual desktop automation were some examples of that early on. At the hospital I was at, like I said, they're asking, is there a way we can go double click on the x-rays in the room and then go in there and it's just ready for the patient? So early on, the way I did that was Imprivata had some abilities to do some scripting based on actions. So we renamed their machine the same thing as their username, and I ran a little RDP script that would connect to that. Jason was working on something very similarly, I think, with VMware, which when I was at Siemens several years later, we helped to spearhead a lot of that out there with our team, where we were combining Imprivata's badge tap with VMware Horizon. Like that time, I think it was called View still, to automate that and to give clinical workflows. So at Siemens, that was actually one of our main delivery models. Was when you go in and you put in a new electronic medical record, for us, it just makes more sense to roam that everywhere. And Siemens solution was designed that way. Epic has some more nuances, which maybe might not work as well that way. But I think a lot of it is just, unpacking that, looking to streamline, while also nowadays, obviously having a strong mind towards security and balancing that. It's really just ends up kind of being that balance of user experience and security, where you're enabling people to be more secure by creating workflows, that they're actually happy using and enjoy using.
So if let's say I'm a vendor and I'm trying to provide in a HIPAA compliant way a solution to a healthcare institution, how do I go about streamlining the experience? What should I focus on?
I mean, I think it comes down to, each individual organization, how they work and how they interact. I mean, for the most part, it ends up being kind of very similar workflows, though. Like Jason was talking about, the differences there on the speed and need to access things quickly. Also combine that with shared machines. So now you're talking each patient room, there's 15, 20 people getting on and off of that all day. Are you going to have those people log into Windows each time, or do you want to have a shared profile that they log in and out of, things like that? And then how do you apply authorization and rights management and device trust to those things when the user is not logged into Windows? So it creates some interesting challenges there. But I think looking at the actual workflows that organizations are using and that are effective for them and helping to expand and to bridge that has been an area I've seen. So technologies like RPA are becoming more popular in healthcare, kind of having a rebirth in a sense. Where they're saying, okay, we've got these tools that work really well for provisioning and lifecycle that have SCIM support, but the number of applications that can support fine-grained permissions in healthcare is pretty small just natively. So you're looking at a lot of workarounds and creative ways to make that happen. But I think, again, it's just kind of meeting them where they're at and understanding, the application sets and the workflows that they're actually using.
How about the security challenges that go alongside those?
Oh, Jason.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing there is going to be balancing security and convenience, right? While delivering the necessary workflows as quickly as possible. And it goes back to that same thing, right? It's the number of interactions per day. And there was a point in the past where we quantified ROI around time savings, right? So it was, how much time can we save a provider by streamlining some of their interactions, making it, we always used to say what we want to do is we want to add security, but we want to do it and make it as transparent as possible. It shouldn't impact the user themselves, because what it essentially does at the end of the day is it gives them time back, which gives them more time with their patients, or they can see more patients, those sorts of things. So there's a real way to quantify the value that's being delivered. But it really is a balance between security and convenience to a degree, because, if it's not, it needs to be secure, but it needs to be fast and transparent, I think is the way I think about it.
I'd even say that if it's not convenient, it's not secure. I have an example that's not exactly healthcare, it's actually government, but it's a government operation where the solution where when you needed to upload information into the secure network, you have to go through a set of instructions to sanitize it before it can go in. And they created a very sophisticated, highly secure solution that checks for everything possible, covers all the vulnerabilities, but it just took too long. And in one incident, one of the people working in the organization, they said, "Oh, I have just this tiny file that I need, and I can't allow just it will take an hour to go through this entire process for this tiny thing. So maybe I'll skip the process just for this small thing." And that ended up being a malware that they've introduced into the network that basically ran havoc through everything. And while they had the most sophisticated system in place, it was worthless because the people didn't find it convenient enough to actually stick to the rules.
Well,
It's
and
like
that's a great point, right? Because it's what you don't want are folks to circumvent the security because it's, too heavy, too complicated.
it's like that old picture of the gate where you see all the people driving around in snow.
Right.
That's perfect for healthcare, and that's honestly what was happening for so long. We created these walls to get in with all these complex passwords, but everyone was just sharing them or putting them underneath the thing. If you make it easy for them to just go through that gate, then you can wall the rest of it, and it's compliant and better for everyone.
So we've been with digital healthcare, which is kind of taking over the entire space. Do you feel that it has made things more secure or less secure? Because it obviously adds more convenience, but it also maybe creates more gates.
Oh, it's absolutely less secure. And let's give an example,
That's
right?
encouraging.
So HIPAA, as an example, right? It's about removing or protecting the patient and limiting disclosure of their information, right? Because if you look at it, healthcare is one of the most challenging because of the type of data that they're protecting. So you think about, your banking, your financial information, right? Your credit card number, as an example. That gets lost or stolen. Okay, not a big deal. You get your number changed, the bank makes you whole. No harm, no foul, right? But your healthcare information, that's immutable. Once that's released, there isn't a good way to mitigate or recover it. And the challenge that you see is that essentially when things were on paper, it was much harder to compromise that protected health information. Now, with everything being digital, well, now it's, very difficult or more difficult to protect in an online world, right? So that transition has caused a lot of the challenge. So I would say, it's less secure. Your data is less secure than it used to be. And I think that's been proven out. If you look at the news, anything that you can find over the last 3 or 5 years, the number and scope of breaches has continued to accelerate, which is why, at least in the US, the government has put in mandates about breach reporting in healthcare that follow the HIPAA regulations, right? So now you don't get to choose whether you report your breach. There's essentially a threshold. How many patient lives were impacted? And if you breach that threshold, you have to immediately report the incident versus something below that threshold. You just have to kind of report at the end of the year because they're looking for how do you mitigate this. But once that data's out, it's really hard to kind of claw it back. Your information is out there, and now, what I've heard is that the difference between stolen credit card data and stolen healthcare data. So the value of a stolen credit card is pennies to dollars. The value of stolen healthcare information, hundreds of dollars per patient. So it's obviously something that, the bad actors are going after because it's of higher value. I don't know. What do you think, Paul?
Well, on that token too, I mean, there's been so many breaches on that I've heard a lot of folks more concerned now with the integrity of the data. because a lot of, like you said, once it's out there, it's immutable. But then is the integrity of what we're in there and what we're seeing actually accurate? Has that been manipulated? And so I think for a lot of folks now, they're almost past the point of saying, oh, we're getting hacked or someone's getting access to that. It's kind of the same as a lot of the other, zero trust concepts, where the idea isn't necessarily if I'm going to get hacked, but it's probably, when. And I think in the same way, most places are preparing in those sorts of ways. And there are some AI tools now that are even kind of catering to that market, where it's looking at the integrity of the healthcare data and things like that. But yeah, I'd agree 100%. Like thinking back to the way it was pre-EMR to post-EMR, I had locked rooms. Maybe there are some abilities to track better. We can identify HIPAA things, because if someone's going in there and just snooping through records, it's a little bit harder for me to see exactly what they saw via camera or access logs on the door. But on the same token, the exposure and the attack vector is so much larger now, because obviously before you had to be in that room physically and there, where now it's digital and kind of out there for folks. One other thing on that is kind of concerning for me too is, we talked about the value there, but then also I'd say, considering that healthcare applications are probably the furthest behind as far as support for modern identity standards, which we know are kind of one of the best ways to protect that. And that's one thing that I think for hospital CIOs and executives, just putting more pressure on those application vendors to support those modern standards, or at least get to a way, that they can integrate them in as part of their programs, because we are having to use, solutions now like RPA to kind of work around their inability to do API support or anything like that.
Yeah, I think that this motive of like convenience as enable for security, or experience as enable for security, there is another side for this experience. Not only the patients and the doctor, but also the IT people and the developers and the people who are responsible to provide this experience. And in some lower grade security, we have things like WebAuthn and more standards, that help people to get better experience in designing and modeling identity system. Do you think it could work with healthcare too, or it's less secure for healthcare, so just avoid it at any price?
It's an interesting question, because I think we're on the front end of that right now. We're seeing a transition. At least I'm seeing customers start to ask for better and more modern authentication capabilities, right? So Imprivata's delivering some of those, of course, but I see as an industry, you take something like WebAuthn as an example. Yeah, for SaaS-based applications, makes a lot of sense, because it allows you to kind of bridge that and, not necessarily need the same sorts of devices you needed in the past. But I think more accurately, we're trending back towards kind of legacy technology, if you will, right? So you look at things, and what's the kind of modern standard that's starting to show up in healthcare? It's FIDO2, right? And it's really all about delivering a similar workflow, but we're right back to certificate-based validation, right? So part of the challenge I see, and folks are looking at it, they're trying to see if they can enhance their security by moving in that direction. But the real challenge today is those technologies work a little different. They're used to tap and go. Now, in today's, the majority of tap and go that is delivered out there in the market tends to be more on the convenience side than the security side. So there are security mechanisms that could be leveraged, but in most cases, customers are using card serial number only. And so, those devices are not as secure as they used to be, right? You take MyFair and iClass, et cetera. They've been compromised already. So those devices can be cloned. You can add a second factor on to help a little bit, but then you're impacting the workflow again. You move to something like FIDO, and now you're in more of a tap, hold, wait, and go, right? So it takes a little more time to process that authentication. And the workflow is not radically different, but slightly different, which means end users need to be retrained, or the solutions themselves need to continue to evolve to make that process as easy as possible. We've seen a lot of this in the NHS in the UK, where they have both contact and contactless smart card sort of workflows. And in those scenarios, they tend to do things where they start the day with a contactful authentication, which is honestly necessary for some of the back-end EHR data protection they do, what they call the spine. But then they'll transition to a tap and go contactless sort of workflow for other parts of the day. So ultimately, I think it's going to be a combination of things, the right workflow for the right use case that's really going to get us to a more secure way of delivering that. And I don't know what you think, Paul.
No, I would agree. And I mean, I've seen a big shift where historically most healthcare was running Windows and kind of delivering, on a Windows platform, kind of trying to be creative with it. Like I talked about, there's that kiosk mode that allows you to share a Windows session, flip back and forth. But I'm seeing more where the OS is becoming less important. So yeah, there is more WebAuthn and, modern authentication standards being introduced, but there's still kind of the legacy tools. What I have seen though is organizations have, larger organizations have started to standardize on tools and been looking to, authenticate in more secure workflows. For example, going from a Linux device like an iGel directly into a browser and making the tap not necessarily launch VDI like Citrix or VMware like it has been historical, but just launching into a browser, and then you're authenticated into the app in the browser. That's the only thing you're interacting with, and then moving off. Tools like Island are becoming very popular for that sort of thing. But then there's a lot of other kind of interesting VDI technologies out there too, which I think can help with some of that. I've seen things like Sonnet.io that kind of does both virtual desktop type delivery, but then can kind of bridge the gap for some of the legacy application support with RPA, kind of hidden in the background. So overall, to me, what I've seen been most effective for organizations that are successful with an identity program is bridging, the legacy with the modern. Very difficult to do, but the ones who are doing it well have a little bit of both, I think.
Yeah, I understand that. You mentioned before many times HIPAA and NHAs in the UK. And that made me think like me and or and I both living in Israel, and I know like some countries in Europe. But when speaking about healthcare system, we in the technology perspective, we are talking about HIPAA and talk about like the US market. Do you think there is any kind of global standards or global go-to that we can work with healthcare?
It's interesting. I actually was working as an engineer for Imprivata and assigned to Brazil. Oddly enough, I don't know why I don't speak Portuguese, but I went along with the translator and helped them get going with everything. But what was interesting was in the US, Imprivata was very popular because of the HIPAA problem. We tried to talk to them about the same things. They're like, yeah, that's great. And maybe from an ethical perspective, we should do that. And we can maybe advertise and market that we're more private, but we have no government requirement to do that. And so that was one reason that Imprivata was so effective in the US, because there was a need for that. I mean, I bought it originally, honestly, because I had one machine in the X-ray department that had to be logged in with LDAP, but they all wanted to share it. So I needed some way to audit who was accessing it at what time. It could do that on a shared machine. And so I think that problem is there, but in the same token, there's very similar problems on the identity lifecycle side around governance. For SOX, you need to be able to do attestation reporting and things like that. So I've seen a shift, from identity, from an identity vendor perspective, where the requirements around those governance and compliance needs are becoming a little bit more important to them. I mean, they feel like I think the HIPAA problem is pretty much solved in healthcare, with those sorts of tools that can help manage passwords and SSO.
I feel like HIPAA gives you a lot of coverage in terms of expectations between players, especially when you have BAAs in place. But I feel that still for each player, HIPAA gives you pretty rough guidelines on what you need to do. It leaves a lot for you to practice and solve on your own in how you address your technology and how you address your working with different third parties and vendors. And I wonder, especially around IAM, around identity and access management, are there best practices that you recommend applying on top of HIPAA? For example, how to go about managing the identities when addressing healthcare, how to manage the access and permissions for those identities once we have them set?
Yeah, I think, what, at least from my experience, HIPAA is just the regulation or the government mandate that requires you protect the healthcare data, right? And what to do if that data is breached, those sorts of things. It doesn't really tell you how to do it, right?
Yeah.
It's very lightweight from that perspective. So you have to layer on top. What I think the recommendations come down to are, layering on top things like the NIST cybersecurity framework, right? And looking at, okay, and now that's evolved, that's kind of the foundation that zero trust is built on. So now you're seeing at least the US federal government start to mandate zero trust initiative, right, across government agencies. Healthcare is one of those for, government-based healthcare. Beyond that, though, I think what we see is the government here in the US tends to mandate and push standards first, and then the public sector starts to adopt those. And so we're seeing that transition now. I think we're seeing the interest in the zero trust frameworks. How do we get better at, going beyond that perimeter protection scenario, especially now when a lot of the services that healthcare is consuming are starting to be more and more SaaS based. That wasn't true 10 years ago. There was a great reluctance to move things to the cloud because of HIPAA, because it was, perceived to be easier and better to protect it if you keep your arms around it, keep it in your own data center, that sort of thing. That's just not the reality of the world anymore. And
Yeah.
so I think that's where the transition has started to come in.
Yeah,
Yeah.
for sure. You want to say something, Paul?
No, the only thing I was going to add is, I mean, from a best practice perspective, I think a lot of organizations are really trying to get towards, a lot of the same standards that you'd see in other industries like fintech and things like that, like zero standing rights and zero trust. Again, it's just kind of that hybrid legacy that creates the challenge. I've seen it work effectively in newer startup health organizations. They're maybe more clinic focused and have a lot of SaaS based apps, but it's just a real challenge, I think, just because of the application sets that you're dealing with in a lot of cases too, to kind of get to the best standard or best practices that they want to get to.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest challenges here is also the change in mindset, kind of connecting to what you said, Jason, especially around on-premise, hybrid, cloud-based. A lot of people are still kind of sticking or adhering to the old school thought that I'll keep everything closed within my garden and it's how I'll protect things. But that just doesn't work anymore. We see when we look at the malicious actors leveraging access to organizations, it doesn't really matter if they're exposed to the internet directly or not. And actually having things closed in the garden usually means that they're not up to date and are actually more easy to manipulate and actually get access to. But this tension between the requirement to move to the new modern mindset and what you actually have in place, I think a lot of organizations are still struggling with. So maybe we can double click here on best practices. If I, as a healthcare organization, want to implement better access, I want to control with zero trust who does what within my network, within my applications that I'm building. How do I go about that, and how do I connect that to my HIPAA process?
Yeah, I mean, go ahead, Paul.
I was going to say continuous authentication is the thing I've been pointing to more often. I mean, with the choice attack, that really was based on a credential that was cached. But if you're doing that continuous authentication, again, though, that's the challenge in healthcare is there's this constant balance of security and convenience. And if you're doing continuous authentication, that's going to drive most physicians nuts if you don't figure out some easy way to do it, whether that's a phone in your pocket, but then there's trade-offs there. A lot of places don't allow phones. And then is it a company-owned phone versus an employee-owned phone? And so all of those things, I think each organization ends up kind of taking a different approach to it. But I think coming with ways for them to help solve a lot of those problems is what we need to see, more from in the marketplace.
Yeah, and I would add to that, I mean, it all starts with authentication, right? You need to be able to prove the identity of a user. And that goes all the way back to how do you enroll that identity to start with? How do you validate the physical person bound to that digital authenticator, if you will, whatever mechanism you choose? I think the concept of continuous authentication, absolutely. I don't think I've yet seen it done well by anyone. And, there are limitations, complexities. You might say, well, like Paul said, just I've got a smartphone, so I'll use that. Not always what you can do, right? If the device isn't owned or managed by the organization, you introduce other challenges. The end user may not want to use their personal device, that sort of thing. So I think there's still work to be done there. But then that follows directly into authorization, right? So both of those things, it's like a balancing act, right? You have to balance both of those things together to really get an effective, at least starting point for the security operations there. Because if you can't understand who the person is that's accessing, then everything downstream from that is a bigger challenge, right?
Right.
And that's why the new NIST guidelines have come out, when it comes to how you deliver, so identity assurance level, authenticator assurance level, federation assurance levels, those sorts of things, so that you can have a solid framework for how you onboard people with their authenticators and then let them leverage those authentication capabilities via authorization.
And just an example of that I've seen kind of be effective is sort of the next phase. I mean, one is biometrics. I think we probably have a little bit from a technology perspective to get that to be consistent enough to work for providers. They're getting more used to it on their phones and things like that. But there are new cards too. So card obviously is, Jason said, is ubiquitous out there. Everyone loves using it. But there's newer cards now. There's a couple different companies that make them, but they have fingerprint readers built in, and the fingerprint is actually stored directly on a chip on the card. So there's no backend system to manipulate. And essentially what you're doing there is when you put your fingerprint on there, you're unlocking the identity of the card to act as an NFC device at that point. So it'll just act like a dumb piece of plastic until you've done that. So to me, that helps to instantly raise that identity assurance level without really disrupting the workflow. A little bit different. Yeah, you got to hold the card a certain way, but when you explain to them, look, this is the same as putting your fingerprint on that every time, it's just a lot easier. Those sorts of things help. It's just there's kind of a balance right now of cost, implementation, and a lot of the other things, in healthcare.
Yeah.
Well, and I would add to that, I mean, biometrics is definitely helpful in certain circumstances, but it's a range, right? It's the challenge with biometrics is that it's not an absolute, right? There's a threshold built in there. There's a false accept and a false reject rate that you have to manage. And depending on what the hardware is, determines how well it works, right? Like facial recognition, as an example, gotten much better over the years, but depending on the device you're using and the capabilities of the cameras really determines how effective it can be, right? Taking a 3D object, turning it into a 2D representation and trying to build a template out of that can be challenging. If you have the right hardware, it works much better, right? 3D cameras, point clouds, those sorts of things. But, then you're talking about, is the expense of what we're deploying worth the security value we're getting out of it? And so there's, again, a balance, right? It's all about balance, I guess, is the
it's a series of
key of the
trade-offs.
day.
The tightrope balancing act, for sure.
For sure.
I'd also say that I think it's from like what I'm seeing with permit customers, and because of the importance of identity access management, we've been blessed with a lot of healthcare sector customers. And what I see is also doing this tightrope balancing act with where people are finding it challenging, and also finding it challenging with sometimes relying on identity too much as kind of a crutch. A lot of times, of course, you have to have a verified identity. If you don't have that, you have very little that you can build from there. But also that by itself is not always enough. As you said, sometimes the identity changes or is not as verifiable to the level that you need for a certain action. So a lot of times it's also very important not just to understand your identity, but also the policies that you want to apply across the different surfaces that you have, and being able to leverage more dynamic information. So, okay, this is this person, but what is their risk factor? What is their risk score at this point in time? Where are they actually physically right now? What are they connected to? Are they connected
They
through
normally open PowerShell and type net use? Probably not. Those sorts of
So-
Without a doubt, the contextual data is critical component to that. It can't just be about the device or the certificate or the authenticator itself. It goes beyond. Yep, absolutely.
Yeah. The devices can be taken advantage of. The identities themselves, like the people themselves, can go rogue. So the context is very, very critical. And then you really have to have this balancing act on this triangle. You have to have strong verified identities that you use as your center piece to kind of frame everything. But you also need smart policies that actually understand your various surfaces. And you need the right contextual data to connect all of that, because otherwise you have something that is very brittle.
Yep.
At least that's what I'm seeing with our customers.
Well, and I've really liked a lot of the identity detection and response tools and kind of the way they've evolved from not just logging data, but now being able to act on them and provide risk scores. And I see a lot of promise there for, things like we talked about, continuous auth. It might be hard to solve that, but it might be easier to solve what are they actually doing? Do we allow it every time? Do we let that authentication packet even go? So, tools like Silverfort has the ability to intercept packets even from AD. So if you think of, normally someone, once they log into Windows, they open up, a UNC path or a share, that would just automatically authenticate based on their Windows rights. But in this modern world, if that person leaves that for a little bit, or if it's a shared machine, you probably want to revalidate that person. And if their risk score is high, you really want to do it. And so the ability, I think, to act on some of those more micro levels is helpful. And that shows a lot of promise for me on being able to create dynamic risk scores to adjust that. I think we're starting there with a lot of conditional access around MFA. And so people are starting to be more exposed to that idea and, obviously using it in most cases. But I think even deeper than that, on every authentication, if you're using some sort of analysis like that to determine if it should be allowed, that's a kind of another way to attack it rather than, continuously validating the person.
Yeah, I'd say I'm seeing a lot of context come into the equation. I think what we're still missing is the behavioral overlay. So we need individual behavioral models for every user so that we can understand not only the context, but what is normal, what is abnormal, and take all of that, put it together, and use that to quantify the risk so that we can make access decisions, especially when they're being made over and over again in a zero trust model where you don't necessarily want to have, assertable identity that's cached. You want to be able to revalidate, and that goes back to what Paul mentioned before with continuous authentication, but finding a way to do it in a way that makes it more transparent, right? Because I'll tell you, we have a lot of zero trust methodology deployed, and man, if I don't have to log into stuff 30 times a day, like if I was a clinician, it would be terribly impactful. It's irritating as it is. But
Right.
especially when you've got an authenticator on your phone and you're getting a push or you're getting an app-based challenge response, etc. Man, it can happen over and over and over again just as you go from resource to resource. So there's definitely opportunity still left in the air. You would think, hey, authentication, that got figured out a while ago, right? We can do a push notification and OTP to your phone and you're cool. Well, that's not even state of the art anymore, right? So it's an evolving landscape without a doubt where, we're trying to provide better capabilities, make them more transparent, but then you've got the threat actors on the other side looking for, the way around that gate in the fence and being able to compromise those. So continuous race, I guess.
Yeah, arms race, I'd even say. Something that I find interesting in what you said in being able to contextualize things and being able to deduce the behaviors of your user profiles. So something that I find interesting there working for our customers is a feedback loop that you have. If you have good policies, they create good auditing. Good auditing teaches you on the patterns of your people, of those identities. And that can be translated into good behavioral patterns that you can then enforce, create risk scores from, and that allows you to improve your policies even further. And connecting to your next point here, it's a race. So you constantly need to run through this loop, creating better policies, creating better audit logs, creating better behavioral patterns, and rinse and repeat just to, as the Red Queen and Alice behind the looking glass says, you have to run as fast as you can just to stay in place. And I wonder, seeing as it's looks like this is the situation ongoing, what can we do there? So we've been adopting OTPs, as you said, we're looking at the newer technologies. What else can we do to make sure we keep up to date with this mutating, changing landscape?
Yeah, I mean, to me, it's where I've lived the last 15 or 18 years of my life. It's about continuous innovation, right? We need to continue to evolve how we deliver those capabilities, to meet the market needs. And, what we're finding right now, I think we're a little behind right now, to be honest with you. There's a lot of technology out there. Not much of it is really completely solving the problem. Because if it was, we wouldn't find ourselves where we are when it comes to breaches and compromises and ransomware and malware and data, exfiltration that we're seeing across the board. Look at the news any week, and there's a new breach somewhere that has exposed X number of records, right? Whether it be patient data, whether it's financial information, doesn't matter. It's across the board. And it seems to me that it's trending in the wrong direction, honestly, because it's getting worse rather than getting better right now. So I think there's an
I was
opportunity.
hoping to finish on a positive note.
Well, I mean, what I would say there is maybe some opportunity there to kind of combine what people are doing from an identity governance with policy too. I mean, I think that the organizations that I've seen do this well have obviously, regular attestations that are going out to their managers, but why not an attestation on your policy? Why not a regular review and a team that's looking at that rather than responding after there's an issue? If you're proactive and have kind of regular reviews of your policies and things like that, that then causes you to look out for new threats. Like now we've got, AI bots that are coming in, and I'm seeing that with a lot of insurance companies looking for issues with that. And so they're having to respond and adjust their own policies, but kind of treating that in the same way that you do your general identity hygiene. Each one of those policies is part of your hygiene too, and should be regularly reviewed and kind of go on those same sort of schedules, I feel.
Well, and I think that's a great point, right? It's not just about the technology or the authenticator or the, identity you're asserting. It's about the overall scope of how you deploy that, how you manage it over time, and how you maintain it, right? How you educate your users, those sorts of things. There is no, single technology that's going to solve that problem. It's the processes, it's the people, it's all the additional pieces that you wrap around it that I think, tend to get left out or maybe not focused on as much as they should. And so I think that can absolutely help in, moving the needle forward and, finding the best technologies and applying them in the right ways with the right policies to make them as effective as possible.
Yeah. If I can add my own 2 cents here, I'd say first of all, I definitely agree. It's not about having the shiniest new technology, because even if it's shiny now, it's going to be rusty in like a couple of minutes. So it's about having technology that is malleable, that that as you adopt it, you'll be able to push it to the next level, at least a couple levels forward. So it will change with your requirements, and knowing in advance that it's going to need to change. Like if you expect, oh, I'm going to run this project, I'll be done with it, and I'll never touch this again, you're up for a lot of disappointment. So building technology that that you're going to change, and B, building processes around this technology, creating the experiences for your own people, for the patients, for the security apparatus itself, so it can adjust to the new technology as it's evolving. And I find that a lot of times we have customers approach us that have this mindset of, okay, we'll do this once and be done with it. And even before we finish the project, they already see that they need different requirements. And I think it's something that it's a hard thing to accept, that this is a Sisyphean task that it's never going to end. So it's a sweet and sour note, but I think once you accept it, it makes everyone's life easier.
Well, and I think the biggest thing we can do to move the needle forward is to rethink how we build and deliver solutions. I think today, I see folks spend a lot of time trying to take current solutions that weren't purpose built for that use case or scenario, and then bolt on security components to try and make them more effective. And I think as an industry, we need to be working more to build things that are secure by design from the beginning, right? Not consumer grade things that we retrofit or bolt on. You look at like where I live today, it's all about secure endpoint operating systems, right? Alternatives to Windows, where customers deploy those today and they stack 10, 12, 14 different security agents and components on top of that operating system to try and secure it. And what we see in the real world, it might be great for consumers. It's really hard to secure it because the core model is not built to be secure by design, right? So I think the more we can think about that from the start as we deliver solutions for our customers, the better we'll be long term, right? It's about innovating and having the right, I guess, perspective to start. And, you know, I think it will put us further forward than we are today.
Yeah.
The only thing I would add to that too is just I think a lot of the solutions I see are designed for startups or companies that are 100% SaaS and 100% cloud, which they're out there, but that's not, you know, that's not where most of your customer base and most of you know, your users are going to end up. So just making sure that you're kind of considering that, and particularly in healthcare, I think that need for legacy support becomes so important. So yes, build and innovate for the future, but then understand they're probably going to need some bridge to get to where you want them to be in a lot of cases.
Yeah. I think another angle of this is the, like, if you want to design for security, a common pitfall is to try to completely build on your own. And that's what a lot of organizations are aiming for, even from, sometimes it comes from cost saving, sometimes it comes from just thinking, oh, we've been doing this so far, so why not continue? And really, if you want to design things for security from the get-go, you really need the expertise. So either connect with the experts to guide you on how to build this, or better yet, consume the solutions from the experts instead of well, reinventing the wheel in some of these cases. As we're
It's an
coming to
excellent
a
point,
close. Oh,
right?
go ahead, sorry.
Reinventing the wheel is something that none of us should try and do over and over again. Like we should be building on what's been done previously rather than trying to recreate the same thing, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's it's an excellent point.
I think we are mostly coming to the end of the hour, and it was a really fun chat that I actually forgot to tell the audience that they can ask questions, which is usually something that I do in the beginning of the hour, but it was really fascinating one for us that we do like security and identity access management for the variety of spaces. Having this deep dive into the healthcare, you know, how things work is was really eye-opening, and I really hope that also for the audience. So we left like 2 minutes. So if anyone from the audience, no matter if you're on YouTube or LinkedIn or Zoom or whatever you are watching us, if you have any kind of questions or quick topic that you want to bring up, just feel free to write them down and we'll try to answer them in the 2 minutes that we left.
Or afterwards.
Or afterwards, yeah,
in the comments.
definitely.
And as maybe we'll get the questions, but meanwhile, Jason, Paul, anything you want to say for conclusion, kind of sending our audience off?
No, thanks so much for the time. It was a pleasure talking with you guys. I love what you're doing over there at PetPermit.io. And this, I mean, this went so fast. I feel like we've only been talking for 15, 20 minutes. So, you know, anytime anyone wants to talk more identity, you can find me at pauljpettit.com. You know, if you want to reach out, or just me at pauljpettit.com if you want to email me.
Thanks.
Yeah, I reiterate what Paul said. I really appreciate you guys bringing us on and giving us the opportunity to have the conversation. It's been super fun.
Sure thing.
It's our pleasure. Thank you for coming. And yeah, I do agree that the time flew by extremely quickly. We might have to sign you up for a sequel, for a follow-up.
We should.
Sounds
Yeah. I actually plan to do like 30 minutes around the data ownership in healthcare, which I feel totally changed, that patients really want to own their data. And I think that's very interesting how data privacy, data ownership is crossing into identity access management. So I think we have
We have our next topic set. So if people in the audience, if you think that's an interesting topic, say so in the comments. So we'll get that done and ready for you to watch as well.
Yeah, I'd love to talk. I mean, it's kind of SIAM or PIAM. I mean, patient identification and access management in healthcare, or SIAM becomes that in a lot of cases. So it's the same thing, but it's got a lot of weird nuances that make it a little bit different beast than what you normally see. So I'd love to talk about
Yeah,
that
it's
more.
absolutely a different set of challenges, and it's another interesting topic in my mind. It's kind of the other side of the coin here, right?
Right.
It's we're talking a lot about clinicians and their workflows and how the providers deliver care. Now, how does the patient consume that? How do they move their data around? How do they secure their data? How do they access their data? Those sorts of things. Very interesting, because there's a whole set of additional challenges that come with that. So I'd love to talk about that in the future.
Well,
Sounds like a plan.
great.
Jason, Paul, thank you so much.
Thank you,
For
guys.
everyone listening, live or later, thank you for listening. And we'll catch you all on the next one.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
Thanks, guys.
Have a good day.
Bye-bye.
Bye.